Once again, the idea that someone was knocking on the front door seemed rather fanciful. It had not even been a week since Felix and Ginny found their way to the manor house. And yet, there was a bustle of lost souls downstairs in a state of confusion much greater than theirs. For indeed, the group downstairs was still quite unfamiliar with the magical unusualness of everyone's situations on this particular day. Perhaps they were no more or less confused than Felix and Ginny, but their grievances were certainly louder.
Go on!
Come on!
As soon as Felix opened the front door, the crowd began shuffling in. Most of them spent all morning wandering lost from one bus stop to another, and to finally arrive somewhere was a relief. In reality, their wandering had not much to do with bus stops. They were simply lost, and the bus stops were lost as well. Apart from people and their keys, places could also get lost in the maze. You might get stuck at a bus stop like Lisa and some of the guests here today, but you might also get stuck somewhere else. It was just very fortunate that a bus driver such as Helen seemed to have a knack for finding the right bus stops. And when I say people were lost in the maze, I mean that the hedge maze was now growing everywhere, and simply becoming lost on their way to the grocery store meant that they might turn around and find themselves at a desert, a different town, or stuck at a bus stop if they were lucky. For the moment, the manor house was still at the center of the hedge maze, so if they were luckier still, they might wander into it and find it as a safe haven. Aside from being lost, the crowd presently in the sitting room of the manor house did have something else in common. They were all quite happy to be lost. This fact escaped Felix and Genevieve quite understandably, since the crowd right in front of them were instead grumbling about their situation. Naturally, everyone expected some kind of announcement by the lad with the bird on his shoulder. He seemed to be the proprietor of this fairly small hostel, or perhaps this was a motel. Well, the building didn't look big enough to be any of those. It was almost as if they were all invading someone's house. Almost as if. Genevieve was about to demand an explanation when Helen and Lisa stepped forwards and provided one. It did not take very long for Ginny to connect the dots. Being lost in the maze with Felix made her forget all about the hedges being out of control. They were the reason she was lost to begin with, and now they seemed to have spread much farther than what she first anticipated. In all fairness, she was right for not anticipating such a consequence, because dimensional horticulture did not simply work everywhere. Georgia had tested her hypothesis in different places, and the hedge maze had only taken root in this particular forest. So even if Ginny left the hedges untended for years, it was impossible for them to take root elsewhere and spread this much. For instance, one could grow a path from the hedge maze to the desert, but then they would only be able to go back and forth. To then start at the desert and go somewhere new, they would need to grow another entire hedge maze in that desert. However, based on the events shared by Helen and Lisa, many places seemed to be connected all over, which meant the hedge maze had taken root in a great many places, and much of the world was now intertwined into one big hedge maze. At least that was the foremost hypothesis on Genevieve's mind. She would need time to go over Georgia's writings upstairs and find more about the creation of the hedge maze, since she wasn't here when Georgia first planted it. Perhaps there was a way to fix this mess. As soon as Ginny began explaining, Helen and Lisa were startled, not by the content of her words, but by the words themselves. They thought they were talking to Felix, and not the raven on his shoulder. Well, if the raven was such an eloquent orator, they worried that perhaps Felix was in charge of doing the raven sounds. Thank goodness, they thought, the day had been weird enough as it were. Regardless, they still had a grumbly crowd to deal with. Some of the guests were already shooting them inquisitive glances while listening to that discussion, whereas the rest of the crowd was happy to grumble about their circumstance at a distance. To save everyone a headache, Felix was more than happy to step up and clarify the situation for the entire crowd. They were all lost, he said. This was not a hotel. It was in fact that raven's house. And yes, this particular raven does own a house. She can well understand you, plus her beak is very sharp, so be nice. Genevieve confirmed his statement. Being in the maze for so long did wonders for Felix's social skills. He went on to explain that this sort of thing was likely happening everywhere, and they were already looking into a way to get everyone home safely. It was very fortunate that they ended up here, of all places, given that Genevieve was the current expert about such weird phenomena. None of their phones seemed to be working as well, so if anyone had signal, it would be helpful to confirm this was also going on out there, but for now they were stuck here. A small discussion arose, and Lisa also helped Felix answer questions and put most of the crowd at ease. Some of them did make a face or a noise to signal inconvenience, but for the most part they were relieved. You see, these are a few of the first people to be caught by the HedgeMaze after its expansion, and perhaps they weren't all in the same place when it happened, but they were all in the same situation. These people had each been stuck in an unfortunate set of circumstances, and it wouldn't be incorrect to say that they were already lost even before the HedgeMaze got them. Hopefully from here, it would be much easier to find a path to wherever they were going, because from here, they could go anywhere. Welcome, friends, to the HedgeMaze Hotel. The HedgeMaze Hotel is a collection of far-fetched and courageous accounts of the silly and heartfelt variety. Whenever life is a bit much to handle, remember, baking is always an option. Chapter 2: The Lantern Festival. When Felix offered everyone tea, the mood in the room turned even more positive. The pantry miraculously still had some fresh produce, and Lisa could help him arrange something for lunch later. While the guests were busy in conversation, Helen, Lisa, Felix, and Ginny went to the kitchen to continue their conversation and fix something up for tea time. Helen was more confident about driving in the hedge maze, and so she proposed to simply drive everyone home in the bus. However, Ginny was still a bit hesitant. The hedges weren't behaving as they should, and it would be quite disastrous if everyone got lost in there. Still, they had to try something since the pantry wouldn't stay full forever. In the end, they decided that Helen and Felix would try and find a path out of the hedge maze. Should they be lost, Felix was still confident he could find a way back for them like he already had. Tea was served and Felix accompanied Ginny to the study upstairs. He sat her on the desk and put a small bowl of blackberries beside her. "Are you sure you want to go back there?" she asked him. Felix did share her nervousness, but he was meaning to stop by home. "I live in the valley," he said, "so it's not very far." There was also something else on Felix's mind. His phone had died ages ago, and it would be very useful to know how much time had passed since he entered the hedge maze and they met. Ginny hopped around the desk and found an astrolabe under a stack of papers. She helped Felix operate it since she lacked the thumbs to do it. "It's been 4 months, she said. If that were true, it was likely that Felix no longer had an apartment, so Genevieve offered that he stayed here at the manor, as it was not like she needed her entire bed at the moment. She gestured with her wings to drive the point across. Felix was very thankful for the offer, and so he gave Ginny some more scritches and left the door ajar at her request. When Genevieve imagined herself finally finding a path back to the manor and to her study, she imagined that the next few days would be filled with figuring out a way to reverse her feathery situation. However, she felt too responsible to worry about anything else right now, and so she pointed her priorities away from worries about feathers and towards further deciphering George's tea-stained scribbles. For now, we'll leave Ginny to her work. Please do not disturb this raven while she's reading. She's currently solving the world's problems. Downstairs, the sitting room was warm with conversation. The guests were getting to know each other while also keeping busy in a helpful sort of way. And of course, each of them had a story to share. A radio hobbyist named Gerald got lost this morning just after picking up some new equipment. If he had arrived home instead, he would have no time to test it. But now it was actually a very helpful thing to do. Perhaps he could establish communications with the rest of the world. Olivia also got lost this morning. When the hedge maze got her, she was actually carrying a big bag of camping supplies from a campsite back to her car. All these extra sleeping bags were headed straight to storage for an indefinite period of time. But now she was glad they might have a use. Granted, they would likely have to spend at least one night here until the raven that owns this house is able to figure out a solution to this very unfortunate mess. There were also people like Egbert, Eliza, and Louise. Egbert was a retired teacher and owner of a used bookstore. Presently, he was carrying a heavy box of books that had been thrown away. This sort of thing happened all the time while he lived. It was the very reason why he opened his bookshop. But lately he grew tired of salvaging these good works, only to see them being discarded once more. Now he was just happy to have a bit of a break. More than that, He was glad for the company of people that seemed to understand what he was going through. Eliza and Louise both shared his frustrations, being that they also had a love for the arts as a musician and a dancer. These and all other guests rejoiced when Felix and Lisa entered the room with freshly pressed orange juice and sandwiches. Out by the driveway, Helen sat with herself. Her day had been just as dense as everyone else's, but she did not fret, because while everyone else felt lost, she felt bright as rain. The sunlight was the hottest, but it did not warrant looking for the shade. And Helen allowed the heat to radiate over her entire body. She allowed herself to just be. It was numbing in a good way. If she were to open her eyes, the first thing she would see would be the hedges surrounding the manor. However, when she did open them, she barely noticed the hedges, because her attention was all on the horizon. From now on, whichever direction she picked, the hedges would be of no impediment, and the thought of standing up no longer seemed to be accompanied by a constant anxiety over stumbling or falling. In this moment of pause, Helen truly and mindfully took the weights off her shoulders one by one and soaked in a unique peace she once believed impossible to be hers. And when she did stand up, it was to begin again, to begin anew. However, no one in good conscience can begin anew on an empty stomach. So Felix came outside to join her for lunch. He wore an apron and carried with him 2 tall glasses of orange juice and a few sandwiches. Together they sat on the steps by the entrance of the manor house and had a lunch break. Felix couldn't help but be curious about Helen's temperament. Out of everyone there, she seemed completely unaffected by the situation. She was quite used to being lost, of course. She told Felix as much. Although today was the first time since perhaps childhood that she wasn't. In contrast, today was the first time since Felix's childhood that he was truly lost. Well, not precisely today, but ever since he entered the HedgeMaze with Ginny. And yet there was something similar about their stories. "I hope this is temporary for you," she told him. But to her surprise, Felix seemed to be perfectly okay with his situation, much like the other guests. For most of his adult life, he wondered what he might find while chasing butterflies in the woods, what he might again learn from getting lost as he once did as a kid. "It just feels like learning," he said. It was true that he couldn't navigate the maze as freely as her, but he had learned his way back to the manor, back to Ginny's, and for now, that was enough. This attitude made Helen feel a little less guilty for wishing the world stayed upside down just so things kept making sense to her. "Maybe my life was already upside down," Felix continued, "because now things are starting to make more sense. It might not have fixed everything, but I think it's my job to figure things out." Helen thought of all the work she did in the past few years to rescue herself and heal her bruises. "It's not that difficult," she said. "I mean, it's hard, but it's worth it." Once they were done with lunch, They got ready to depart. Helen got the engine warm and Felix took their plates and cups back to the kitchen. He was about to take care of the dishes when Lisa stopped him. There was no need for him to worry about dishes when he had to journey into the hedges with Helen. To be perfectly honest, Felix was in want of a chore to procrastinate before heading out. He was still not sure if he was ready to go back home. So they compromised. He would wash the dishes and she would put them away. Lisa thought it was the least she could do. Besides, it was refreshing to see people worried about the well-being of others like that. You know, Ginny just feels very responsible about the whole thing, said Felix. She worries quite a lot, but in turn, I get to worry about her, which is not half bad. Lisa was glad for the sweetness in his voice. In her experience as a nurse, help was usually most needed when it was no one's responsibility in particular to offer it. She assured Felix that she would look after Ginny and the other guests while he was away. There was just one condition, that Felix stopped by a grocery store and got her favorite snack, blue cheese. Felix, of course, obliged. Besides, it was probably wise to stop by a grocery store anyway and stock up. He said his goodbyes, and they finally went out. Going back home after so long was quite odd, because Felix had always been responsible and dependable. Even at times when he overstayed, he returned home just in time to put everything back into place and to not have broken any promises. Whenever he did find himself a bit lost, either by chance or intention, he would wait and listen, just as he had learned as a child, as there was always a way for him to build a connection with his surroundings and understand them. Regardless of how uncertain life may be, when Felix was lost, all he had to do was wait and listen. So he often wished to forever lose himself in the mountains. But one way or another, he always found the way back. Even in the hedge maze, when he was as lost as he could have possibly been, there was still a part within him, open and vulnerable, listening and learning. And that part of his unconscious found the way back to the manor house for his and Ginny's sake. Now, for the first time returning home, he was unsure of what to expect. But this uncertainty was new, and new felt good. Next stop, Evermost Valley. There were many new happenings in the world today, as the hedges and vines did not discriminate between any particular place, town, continent, or world. There lived 100 stories of all genres across everywhere. And though we might get to talk about a town where the sun and moon rise and set the other way around, a detective forced to chase his crime scene across many worlds, or a mountain where every season now happened all at once, we will begin with a case much less absurd, which is the one concerning the town of Evermost Valley. Named after Sir Thomas Evermost Bright, an architect, urbanist, engineer, and inventor, Evermost Valley, in its infancy, could not have been called a town, much less a village. There, the weather was atrocious and the landscape unreliable. During winter, There was always a snow blanket over the trails, making sure people got turned around however many times necessary for them to be forever lost. During summer, the rainstorms rarely ever paused, and the ground was so muddy it shifted the landscape enough that anyone would find difficult navigating or remembering any of it. Up until that point, Sir Thomas's life had been composed almost exclusively of adventure. He had designed and built many wonders across different corners of the world, such as the midday spear, the tortoise, and the gallant. Each bigger and more complex than the last, meant to exude history and functionality. He oversaw their construction through earthquakes, hurricanes, and thunderstorms. He helped build and rebuild settlements after such storms and quakes had ruined them. His blueprints and schematics changed and adapted constantly. Each day of every month of all his years were new, different, and unpredictable. Life was about adapting and overcoming, so when it came time for him to retire, he found comfort in the day-to-day life of the valley folk. There was always something to repair or someone to help, which for some folk might be cause for distress, but not to the valley folk. The first cottage ever built in the valley, without it being carried away by winds or storms, was that of a mountain man named Malo, who was looking to get away from the bustle and hustle of the city. The second, third, and fourth homes built in the valley had the same idea, so much so that they were built quite far apart from one another, and for a time, the valley folk were completely unaware of each other. However, living by their lonesome in such a remote and wild place was quite a miserable kind of living, their main priority being keeping oneself alive and one's roof from collapsing. And after a particularly bad storm, most of the valley folk decided to give up this dangerous life, for perhaps the hustle and bustle of the city wasn't so bad after all. However, that decision to leave was most fortuitous because every single one of them had decided to do so on the same day, and it was on that day, while making their way out of the valley, that they all stumbled upon each other for the first time to find that they weren't alone, that they in fact had neighbors. And when the snowfall became heavy, the whole caravan turned itself around and found shelter at Malo's cottage, which was not just the closest but the largest and sturdiest one. That night, they dined and shared in a warm company with each other. Suddenly, it was not very difficult to come up with a reason to stay. Elmer could go into town every other day to buy fresh produce and run small errands for his neighbors. Donna was an expert in chopping firewood and repairing any and all furniture. Malo was happy to open his doors and make his cottage a sort of public house, where his neighbors could weather storms, eat together, and find company. From there on, the valley folk always found something to make life a little easier for one another. Malo also built a few sturdy stone posts along the path to his cottage. They were tall enough to poke through the blanket of snow, and in each of them there was enough space for a lantern. Before sunset each day, he walked the trails to light them. Then, if his neighbors ever found themselves lost in the dark, the lanterns would guide them safely to his home. When Sir Thomas, ever most bright, first moved to the valley, He endeavored to build his cottage all on his own, but he soon ran into the valley folk and learned that not a single one of them could watch him work without helping. They provided him with something to break his fast, helped him carry the beams of wood, hammer them in the proper places, and gave him expert tips on how to deal with moisture and mold. Marlowe also offered him a spare room in his cottage, as there was no need for Thomas to make do with camping while his roof was under construction. Once his cottage had been finally built, it became clear to Thomas that a housewarming dinner was inevitable and inescapable. It was a merry gathering that went late into the night. Whenever someone decided to leave and say goodbye, they would perform the valley folk goodbye ritual, which meant spending another hour standing by the front door in conversation. Each goodbye made Thomas feel more at home and a part of the community. The last one to say goodbye was Marlowe. However, there was no way Thomas would let him walk all the way back to his cottage at such a late hour. Much like Thomas, he was an older fellow and he knew that at least a nap was warranted after such a big meal. So for all Thomas was concerned, he could nap until morning at the guest bedroom. Marlowe did attempt to dodge the offer with a few excuses, but he recognized a level of stubbornness in Thomas which he also shared, so he acquiesced. However, instead of sleeping, both gentlemen spent the entire night talking and smoking pipe tobacco, until the both of them passed out on the sofa by sunrise. Later that week, they were happy to continue their late discussion at Marlowe's place. It became a habit for Thomas to run into Marlowe at sunset and light the lanterns with him. During these walks, he learned Marlowe's knees weren't what they used to and walking the trails was taxing on them. It was impossible for Thomas to learn such a thing and not do anything about it. He sketched and planned, and during spring and autumn, when the valley was less treacherous, he worked to make the trails more walkable. With Donna's help, he deforested and reforested the right areas and found ways to make the water drain to the right brooks, so the paths no longer shifted under rainfall. In time, the valley became a more reliable place to live. When Marlowe found out about Thomas's projects, he was happy to help him understand the ecosystem surrounding them and work with it, not against it. They worked together from first light to sunset and stopped only to light the lanterns and sometimes to sleep. The valley folk came to have less of a burden on their shoulders. Snowstorms and thunderstorms weren't so bad after Thomas fixed up your roof with the new adaptations they'd both been designing. And a safer valley meant more neighbors. What were once a few cottages turned into a proper village. Elmer opened a general store and Donna a lumbering and carpentry business. Still, the valley folk never missed a chance to lend their neighbors a hand. Marlowe's old home became a tavern around which the city center developed. Of course, he moved out of there to live with his husband, Thomas. Many say that Thomas's old name was simply Thomas Bright, and that he took the name of Evermost when he married Marlowe. Others say Marlowe was the bright one and took the name of Evermost from Thomas when they married. Regardless, the important thing was that together, only together, they were ever most bright. In their elder years, the Evermost couple no longer had the constitution for construction, but they were still quite stubborn and couldn't bear sitting around all day. So their neighbors could always find them at sunset, walking together and lighting the lanterns as they did. After their passing, the town of Evermost got its name to celebrate their memory. The tavern at the city center also passed down to their children, who kept the establishment's name as Mallow's Cottage, the first home in the valley. Remembrance also came in the form of a festival, and at the turn of each season the entire town would turn off their lights at sunset and light the lanterns outside. People would go out and gather in each other's homes, or at the center of town in taverns and pubs to make merry and be thankful for a safer valley. During these nights, the entire valley twinkled with a myriad of lights like constellations. And only after very long goodbyes, everyone went home under the safekeeping of the lantern lights and their neighbors. The Evermost children also kept their parents' notebooks. They were filled with inventive designs that were further studied and expanded upon. Neighborhoods were built in such a way as to tame the winds and prevent hurricanes. Gardens and parks were designed to contribute to a gentler climate with more stable temperatures. The woodlands were monitored, and animal populations were kept healthy for a healthy ecosystem. The valley went from a wild and chaotic place to a very gentle one. Generations passed and culture also shifted. Growing up in a gentler place meant winter was not so different from summer or spring, and so the people could make do mostly by themselves. The valley folk became more and more reclusive, and not many of them kept the habit of lighting the lanterns alive. In a way, the valley was much colder, and nowadays one would be surprised to find someone there remembered. Evermost Valley became a place for the most bright, a place for brilliant minds to gather and for ideas to collide. In their minds, it was less about helping their neighbors from across the road and more about helping their neighbors all over the world. Stories from books like Around the World in 79 Days by the famous explorer George Wells and The Poetics of Wondrous Construction by architect Thomas Evermost Bright beckoned young minds to seek a bright future in the valley. Felix was one of these minds who 10 years ago moved there after being accepted to the University of Evermost. Their motto, of course, was, "Here we are evermost bright." Hooray! Soon after, he won a position in one of the many enterprising companies in the valley, and did his share of helping the world walk towards a brighter tomorrow. However, helping the world didn't quite look like what Felix once imagined. Being a kid that once chased butterflies in the woods and called it research, Felix asked himself, how did he end up staring at datasets all day long? All his colleagues seemed to do was worry about this brighter tomorrow. They worried about being right, about results, numbers, companies, projects, experiments, prototypes, and datasets. Felix himself worried as much as he could in order to provide the world with numbers and results. I don't mean to be reductive towards numbers. They are quite magical, even more in a place like Evermost. You see, in about 12 odd years, Felix's numbers would magically turn into a thing called a synthetic enzyme. And afterwards, by chance, another person full of worry and curiosity will stumble upon a way to use it as a pesticide, providing the world a chemical-free alternative much less harmful to the environment. These kinds of discoveries took time, and the valley folk felt an ever-present pressure to uncover them. What at first might look like coldness was in fact warmth. It was true that the valley folk worried about many things, but they also worried about each other. You see, people in the valley saw their brightness above all else as a responsibility. They didn't see themselves as different from others, for being bright was a choice, and a kind of choice one must make responsibly. Each of them had so much to worry about that the best they could do was give each other space. Their distance was meant to reassure, as if to say, whatever you might be going through, I will not intrude in your personal life, so you may figure things out in your own time. Indeed, it was reassuring to know that their colleagues would never make a problem out of their troubles. But handling them on their own was often quite lonely. And yet, it was this distance that allowed the valley folk to focus and provide the world with their discoveries. Felix's day-to-day were full of worry, from his time at university to his shifts at work. Over the years, his routine became more untenable. Perhaps if he replaced every aspect of his life with due diligence, a life such as that would become viable. But how long would that last? To be perfectly honest, this lifestyle never agreed with Felix once. Actually, it was hard to believe that this kind of routine could agree with anyone at all. But then again, there were people like Annabelle. She was Felix's neighbor from across the hall. Her home was her sanctuary. There, she was surrounded by textbooks, spreadsheets, and plants. Her days were spent working, learning, brainstorming solutions with her plants, and sleeping. She only left the sanctuary of her home to be in the sanctuary of her lab. From the outside, her days all looked the same, but under all that pragmatism, there was also a passion brimming with curiosity. Each day was a unique opportunity to discover, to crack impossible puzzles, and answer unanswerable questions. There was no such thing as monotony in Annabelle's life, and her plants proved sufficient company whenever she needed it. In fairness, every single plant in her apartment was Felix's once. Every time he went chasing butterflies in the mountains, she adopted his plants and tended to them. Then Felix would just buy a new plant and keep it, knowing that it was a matter of time before Annabelle adopted another one. Before Felix moved there, Annabelle's depression was way less manageable, and so he was happy to make her life a bit brighter whenever he could. When it came to accepting help, the valley folk were hopeless, but Felix always found ways around it. Gordon, his neighbor from upstairs, always got a few muffins that were left over whenever Felix purposefully baked too many for one person. Rita, who once studied with Felix and now lived all the way across town, was happy whenever Felix sent her letters written by hand with photographs of particularly interesting plants he found during hiking. She had no choice but to write back in kind, and despite their distance, they enjoyed a very close friendship. A younger Felix once believed that he made more of a difference in the lab, but nowadays he struggled to be half as productive as back then. And when his nerves were too much to bear, he wrote letters, baked muffins, gave away plants, and sat in the woods to listen to the forest. For a long time, Felix felt stuck and never quite able to recover completely. But after spending all that time lost with Ginny, and after putting together a basic meal with Lisa for everyone back at the manor, things seemed to have unstuck within him. For the first time, perhaps ever since entering university, his future felt uncertain in a good way. This good kind of uncertainty was what Annabelle and many others felt while living a life Felix was on his way to give up. And so, giving license to irony, if he wanted to live a life of passion like theirs, he would have to live a different kind of life. It was mid-afternoon when Helen and Felix arrived at Evermost. The sky was cloudy and the city different. Last time Felix was here, Evermost had been its carefully designed self, but now the roots and vines spread all the way down the mountains from the HedgeMaze. This caused the neighborhood to be shuffled about everywhere. It was as if the entire town were two completely different puzzles forced to fit together. I do not believe the hedges intended this disorder upon the inhabitants of Evermost. It seemed that their intention was actually to restore the valley to its former self, even if it meant the valley would become treacherous once again. Helen was still able to drive in the shuffled streets of Evermost. She knew which way was which, but it was impossible for her to know where Felix's address had been shuffled to, at least not without first meticulously driving around in order to draw an entirely new map of the town in her head. Not to mention that Felix had likely been evicted at this point, so it was unlikely they would find his things in his previous address. The neighborhoods being shuffled about also meant that the design of the town no longer tamed the weather, and a storm was surely on its way. Felix thought that he could use his newfound sense to locate his apartment. And so Helen parked the bus and they stepped out on the sidewalk. The storm was near and a fog began to flood the streets. Felix closed his eyes and focused on the memories of baking muffins, of having small interactions in the corridors, and of spending the nights alone reading, accompanied by stray cats in the back garden. Even if this place was no longer home, it had once been home, and dear places such as those do miss us when we are away. The path back to the manor was still in his mind, though a new direction became clear, not too far from where they were standing. He and Helen walked a short distance, but they arrived not at a building, but at an old stone post. Inside of it Felix found a rusty old lantern. At this time, he wasn't aware of the significance of these old stone posts. The reason why he lit the lantern was simply because the fog was too thick to see through. The warm light cleared the fog and it allowed them to see a safe path towards another lantern. At this very moment, there were other lanterns being lit for likewise simple reasons all across the valley, by folk very much like Felix, because the truth was that the diligent routines of the valley folk could never be self-sufficient. Even if Annabelle and Gordon and Rita all lived in such a way that days were made easier by neighbors like Felix. Besides, their neighborhoods were not just occupied by burned out friends who took up baking and letter writing. The first person to light the first lantern this afternoon was a firefighter off duty. Right now, she led a small group of people safely to higher ground at the center of town as it finally began to rain. Another trail of lanterns were lit by a grocery store worker who every day went out of his way to carry everyone's groceries to their car and make home deliveries whenever time allowed. There were nurses, postal workers, trash collectors, delivery drivers, technicians, plumbers, and the whole community who did not contribute to breathing the future into existence, but instead breathed support and ease into the lives of the ones who did so. Unknowingly, these folk had lit the lanterns before for simple reasons like the ones today. They had kept them clean of weeds, decay, and rust, much like one tends to the sidewalk in front of their house, or a campfire that keeps their neighbors warm. But today was the first time when all lanterns were lit at once by their keepers, and this was also the first time the valley folk realized that even though they felt alone, they had always been a part of a community who cared, a community they had so far neglected, because together, only together, they were ever most bright. When Felix and Helen found a safe path by lighting the lanterns, they went back to the bus, already with a small group behind them, and began driving towards higher ground as the rain fell harder. The town of Evermost went dark, and with the cloud cover and fog it was impossible to see. But any hiker looking down from the mountain range would notice the constellations of lantern lights stitching together the shuffled streets into safe trails, much like they once were when Marlowe first built them. On their way, Felix and Helen picked up everyone who had still not evacuated to safety. They found Rita, who immediately recognized Felix from their college days. She had a backpack with a few important affects to keep them safe from the flood, amongst which were a few dear letters of his. They embraced and found a little sweetness in each other, in spite of the current turmoil. They also found Gordon, but he was not at home. He was stuck at a bakery buying muffins. Felix's next batch was long overdue, and so he took matters into his own hands and made friends with a baker who was now boarding the bus with him and a box of baked goods. Gordon was overjoyed to see Felix. He introduced him to his baker, and they had the classic exchange of, "This is the fellow I was talking about." And so the dark clouds and gloominess of the occasion became less and less relevant. Before they all arrived at the center of town, Felix's inner compass caught a new path, not too far from them. There was a small flame dancing in a rusty old lantern, being almost snuffed out by the horrible weather. This stone post stood by the sidewalk of Felix's old apartment building. When they arrived, there already was an inch of water on the ground floor, and the back garden had been turned into a quagmire. He tried for his door, but it was locked and his key no longer worked. However, Annabelle's door was ajar, so he called for her and entered as she answered him. Her socks were drenched, and she was putting her affects into boxes and putting them onto tables and tops of furniture to prevent water damage, which would surely ruin her more precious books and more delicate plants. Her distress brought her to the verge of tears, and she was at a loss of what to do. She was shivering quite badly as well, so Felix hurriedly grabbed a towel from the bathroom to drape it over her and protect her from the rain as they left for the bus parked outside. He tried to lead her out, but she didn't want to abandon her things. The rain was not letting up, and the other passengers began to worry because Felix was not coming out of the building. Helen and a few others entered and found Felix calming down Annabelle. Helen was immediately worried and asked if she was hurt and if Felix needed help carrying her out. But Felix explained that she was worried about her things and that they needed to take at least a few boxes with them, so he pointed out the most important ones. Once Felix made the request, the very common thought of the valley folk crept up his mind. Maybe he was asking too much, but there were no second thoughts from Helen, Gordon, Rita, and the others, and so they safely made it out of there with Annabelle's treasures. When they were safely back in the bus, Felix pulled out a fresh pair of socks from his satchel and gave them to Annabelle. They sat together on the carpeted floor of the bus with boxes of things on the seats and hallway. One of those boxes was already open. In it, there were a few books and small potted plants. Annabelle was still a bit too distressed to speak, but she nudged one of the boxes towards Felix. He opened it and found some of his own mail, a few of his favorite books, and a Tupperware of dough mix that was likely a bit too old at this point. Ever since Felix was evicted, Annabelle had been taking care of his things and picking up his mail. Many of the boxes she was trying to save weren't hers, they were his. From the day they became neighbors, she never just thought of herself and her own self-sufficiency, but caring for his plants, buying him books, and now safekeeping his things was her way to look out for someone that was obviously burned out and still worrying about her. When they reached the city center, they found it warm and dry. The hedges had shifted the whole place up to the mountainside. From there, they could look down on the valley and see the shifting clouds raining down on the shuffled neighborhoods, as well as the lantern lights shining over the trails and roads that led them safely there. The power was still out, and as early evening arrived, business owners put out candles and lit a number of lanterns around the city center. They also set up tables, stands, and grills around the main square to serve food, drink, and provide people with a place to linger while the storm subsided. Felix, Helen, Annabelle, Gordon, and Rita decided to sit down on the tables out front Milo's cottage to catch up, and as Annabelle's stress went down and she was able to speak again, their conversation went long and loud into a lantern-lit night. Naturally, they weren't the only ones making merry tonight, for there was one who had waited for this night ever since she had called the valley home. That person was the current owner of Milo's cottage, Harper Evermost Bright. Her parents thought it was a waste of time to keep the place open, which was the usual demeanor of their generation. A generation who had forgotten the festivals, the lanterns, and focused solely on being bright. But the memory of her great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers was very precious to Harper, and she never let them close down the tavern, with the promise that she would take care of it when she was of age. She was the youngest of 3, and her older siblings were very busy and successful, and so her parents, albeit cautiously, eventually granted her wish. While many of her great-grandfather's notebooks with inventive diagrams and schematics were kept safe by the family, there was one she stole from her parents' study and kept herself. It held the story of Thomas's arrival in the valley, of the construction of his cottage, which was the house she grew up in, and of the dinner party that followed. He also wrote about his love for Milo and the lanterns they lit together at sunset. Seeing that the Lantern Festival was created after their passing to honor them, Harper did not find it in their diaries. Her grandmother knew it from when she was a very young girl, at a time the family still remembered. Harper couldn't have nostalgia for it, as it was something she had never experienced. But there was a longing within her still, a longing we can call hope. She had tried to bring back the festival many times since taking ownership of the tavern, but it had never worked. Still, in the process of failing, she built a place of respite and camaraderie for those who just needed a break from untenable routines and very busy living. Her regulars did throw a celebration every now and then by hanging paper lanterns from the ceiling and drinking until late, and it was a very fortunate thing that Harper had kept these lanterns in the back room. Tonight, her regulars went about the city center hanging up lanterns wherever they could and telling people of this long-forgotten festival. Drinks were flowing back at the tavern, and Helen with rosy cheeks was buying another round for everyone, while Harper shared stories of her grandfathers. Before the night was through and the valley folk followed the lantern safely home, the rains ceased and the view from the valley beneath them was clear, so much so that the lantern lights and the stars in the sky were a perfect mirror of each other. It was almost as if they were one. It was then that a strong wind rushed up the mountain and picked up all the paper lanterns, taking them into the sky, so their lights and starlight became one, and a new constellation formed in this universe. The Lantern Keeper. From this day on, life will be different in the valley. It won't be easier, but it will be worth it and warm, for as long as there are those who keep the lanterns lit. Hi friends, thank you so much for listening to the first chapter of the HedgeMaze Hotel. It makes me so happy to have you, you have no idea. So, if you want to enjoy some early access, consider joining the Patreon as a free member, as all Prelude episodes will be posted there first for free. I'll also be posting updates and news there, so if you want to be a part of the community, that's the place to go. If you would like to further support the show, you can join one of the paid tiers starting at $3. And if you do, you have early access not only to the Prelude episodes, but to the full episodes, as well as full transcripts if you like to read along. I can't wait to finish work on the next chapter so I can share it with you all. This episode was written, edited, narrated, and stitched together by me. The music and sound effects were provided by various artists, and you can check them out in the show notes together with all the relevant links. Know that you've been a most fortuitous guest, and if you ever find yourself lost again, our services ought to be right round the corner. We hope you've enjoyed your stay, enough to come back to the HedgeMaze Hotel. Bye everyone.